There's an endless argument in photography when you're choosing a camera, what sensor size do you go for? Do you go for full frame, or do you go for aps-c, or do you go for micro four thirds? Or something else entirely. But one of the advantages that people portray for going for a smaller size sensor is that you can have smaller, lighter lenses. Except that's not strictly true. It's partly true that because you're dealing with a smaller sensor, you don't have to project as big an image from the lens, so for the same paper specifications, that means the lens can be made smaller. However, where it becomes false is if we are looking at exact comparisons to each other, i.e. you're wanting to produce the exact same look from an aps-c or a micro four thirds that you get from a full frame. Now, you're probably already familiar with the concept of crop factor to your focal length, in that if you're using, say, an aps-c camera, then you have to apply either a 1.5 or a 1.6 times crop factor to your focal length to get your effective angle of view that you would be seeing from a full frame lens. Well, you kind of have to do the same with your aperture when you're looking at depth of field. Now, as a basic overview of crop factor in your aperture, when you're looking at depth of field, there's two important factors to consider: the distance to your subject and the physical size of your iris opening in your lens. Now, because here we're looking hypothetically at exactly the same physical look between the full frame and the aps-c and the micro four thirds, we're going to presume that the subject is the exact same distance and we're going to be shooting at the same effective focal length. But because that's only effective focal length, not physical focal length, and your aperture number is a ratio of your physical focal length, then if you are using a shorter focal length for the same aperture value, you actually have a smaller iris opening, and thus you get a deeper depth of field. Now, if you're not familiar with that concept, or that brief summary has confused you even further, I have done another video on this in the past where I explain it in far more detail, and probably a damn sight clearer as well. So I advise you go and pause this video now, go and check that out, and then come back to us. I will leave a link to it up here and down below as well. And for those of you who were crazy enough to understand what I just said, now we'll get into the nitty-gritty of it all. In that, if we are looking at creating exactly the same look from full frame or aps-c or micro four thirds, the sizes of your lenses doesn't really change at all. Because to get the same depth of field with the same effective focal length from an aps-c lens as a full frame, you have to go about 1 f-stop faster, and on micro four thirds it's about 2 f-stops faster. So for example, this lens is the Canon 18 to 150mm f3.5 to f6.3, specific for aps-c mirrorless cameras. Now, with the 1.6 times crop factor, that gives you an effective focal length range of 28.8mm up to 240mm. By comparison, the Canon RF 24 to 240mm is physically a much bigger lens. But two factors for that. The first is that goes to 24mm, not 28.8, so is going to be slightly bigger. And the second, the aperture of that is about f4 to f5.6. Whereas the effective aperture of this would be about f5 to f9. So you'd get nowhere near the same depth of field from this lens as you would from the RF lens. To get the same depth of field, you'd have to get the same effective aperture, so the physical aperture of this lens would need to be f2.8 to about f4. And that would probably make this lens about the same size as the RF lens, just mounted onto this camera body. It's basic physics, you kind of can't get around it. And to prove that, I have got a list here of several other different lenses that we can compare everything up to. So for example, the Canon 17 to 55mm f2.8. That has a physical length of 110mm and a width of 83mm and weighs 645 grams. Now you might be thinking that's a greater effective focal range than a 24 to 70, so surely it's better than a 24 to 70 f2.8, and that thing's 113mm long, about 89mm wide, and weighs over 800 grams. However, once you factor in the effective aperture, you're actually looking at a 27 to 88mm f4. So actually the most direct competitor to the EFS lens would be the Canon 24 to 70 f4 LIS, which is only 93mm long, 83mm wide, and weighs 600 grams. So it's actually smaller and lighter than the APS-C lens. And we have pretty much the same across the board. The Sony 16 to 55mm f2.8G lens, that's 100mm long, 73mm wide, and weighs 494 grams. So it might be a damn sight smaller and lighter than, say, the 24 to 70 f2.8G master lens, but the effective specs of that lens are only actually a 24 to 88mm f4. By comparison, the Sony Zeiss 24 to 70 f4 is 95mm long, 73mm wide, and weighs only 430 grams. So again, slightly smaller and lighter. And it's not just APS-C to full frame, the same rule applies to micro four thirds. If you look at, say, the Panasonic 12 to 35mm f2.8, that is effectively a 24 to 70mm lens as well. That's only 73mm long, 67mm wide, and weighs only 305 grams. So a lot smaller and lighter than the Sony. Until you factor in that an f2.8 on a micro four thirds is effectively an f5.6 on a full frame. So it might be slightly smaller and lighter than, say, the Sony lens, but you're losing an effective one stop's worth of depth of field. Samyang 16mm f2 for Canon APS-C DSLRs, 89mm long, 83mm wide, weighs 583 grams, is effectively a 24mm f2.8. By comparison, the Canon 24 f2.8 IS is only 68mm long, 56mm wide, and weighs only 280 grams. And it even applies to Fuji. Now Fuji, fantastic system. Honestly, I don't talk about them enough, and I really should do, but even they can't break the rules of physics. They're 8 to 16mm f2.8, for example. Behemoth of a lens, 121mm long, 88mm wide, 805 grams, but is effectively the equivalent of a 12 to 24mm f4. Now, as luck would have it, Sony make a 12 to 24 f4 for their full-frame mirrorless cameras. That's 117mm long, 87mm wide, weighs only 565 grams. Now, granted, some of the weight could be down to build quality, but the size still remains the same. No different than, say, the Fuji 50 to 140mm f2.8. 176mm long, 83mm wide, weighs 995 grams. Effective specs of that, 75 up to 210mm f4. Compare that up to the Sony 70 to 200 f4G series, 175mm long, 80mm wide, weighs 840 grams. Now, obviously, one counter-argument to this is that in getting the exact same depths of field, the smaller sensor size lenses actually have faster apertures, so are letting in more light, so you can shoot with a faster shutter speed or lower ISOs. But then that's offset by the larger sensor in the first place. By having a larger sensor, you've got a better signal-to-noise ratio, you can shoot at higher ISOs and get cleaner-looking images. And it's not really a surprise that a full-frame sensor gives you somewhere in the region of about a stop's better noise performance than you get on APS-C, and about 2 stops better than you get on Micro Four Thirds. So if you're currently looking between a full frame, an APS-C, or a Micro Four Thirds setup, and you are looking for getting really shallow depth of field shots, then the sizes of the lenses really isn't going to be any different. However, the availability of such lenses that can get you those shots might be more restrictive for the smaller sensor sizes. But if depth of field isn't a problem for you, then sensor size isn't really a problem for you. But that's pretty much it for this video, guys. As always, if you have any questions or queries, the comment box is down below. While you're down there, if you haven't already, please consider hitting the subscribe button. And there is also a link to my Patreon account down there where you can find some exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and also there will be some exclusive prize draws in the future as well. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.